again. I went full circle back to a priest.
Hello, my name is Wyndham Wise, and welcome to Commffest TV. Our guest today is a distinguished Canadian character actor, Colin Fox. Mr. Fox started his training at the National Film School in Montreal, and since then has worked non-stop in film, voiceover, television, theatre, and God knows what else. He's perhaps best remembered as Dr. Anton Hendricks in the popular series Sci-Factor Chronicles of the Paranormal. Did I get that correct?
Yes, you did.
Yeah, that was hosted with Dan Aykroyd.
Dan Aykroyd,
Well,
yes.
welcome, Mr. Fox.
Thank you very much.
As I said, you started very early in the business. So you were born in what, Aldershot?
I was born in Aldershot, which is on the north shore of Hamilton Bay, opposite Hamilton, and went to school in Hamilton. My parents split up when I was 12, and then I moved with my mother to Toronto. But not that early, because the school I attended didn't have a drama club.
Which school was it?
That was St. Mike's College School.
Okay.
And their emphasis was, no surprise, hockey. And so there wasn't a lot, but actually I did get the gig of being a band concert host for their band concerts, which they took around, and that was fun. Did some stand-up comedy and that kind of thing. But it really wasn't until I was, I guess, 13 or 14 that I ever saw my very first play, which was an amateur production my cousin was in. And then after that, really not very much, other than, of course, lots of film and then TV, in terms of being an observer, but in terms of actually getting on the stage, that took a little longer.
Right. Well, you did, as I said, you ended up at the National Theatre School.
Yes, that's right.
In the fort, when would that be? When would that have been?
That
Just
would have been
pretty soon it opened, right?
Yeah, just about 2 years after it opened. It was in 1963, and the school had opened officially in 1960. So I was in the third year of their existence, and I was there for the 3-year course, which ended actually in 1965.
Any contemporaries that you could name that were there? Because I know William
Yes.
Shatner was there, and so was Christopher Plummer.
Actually, they were Montrealers, but they didn't actually attend the school.
Oh, okay.
But they were taught by the same teachers who taught us at the school, who happened to be marvelous.
There at the same time as Christopher Plummer and William Shatner?
Well, I was certainly a contemporary, almost a contemporary of theirs, because both Bill Shatner and Chris Plummer were Montrealers. And although they didn't go to the National Theatre School, they were past that, the teachers that taught them taught us, who were absolutely marvelous.
When you graduated, did you, was Stratford the next step? Or?
Yeah, Stratford, actually the very first step was with the Crest Theatre at that time.
In Toronto?
In Toronto. I managed to talk Murray Davis into letting me play the lead in Tiny Alice, the character of the priest, this tormented priest who was going through a crisis of faith. And that was a very interesting production to be in, because it was highly controversial. Edward Albee play, as many Edward Albee plays are.
Right.
So then I got a call. I was back in Montreal, hadn't moved yet, back to Toronto. I got a call, and it was Michael Langham from the Stratford Festival,
Oh, okay.
the artistic director
Right.
at the time. Colin, I wondered if you would like to join us. I said, of course, I'd love to. Well, it's an as-cast contract. I had no idea what an as-cast contract was, except that I was going to be in Stratford, and that was all that mattered, right?
Yeah.
So that first season, 1966, was when I had, I think it was 6 words to say, my liege, and they are without. I think it was something like that.
And your first words on stage were?
I think my first words were, my liege, and then bowed out. I was playing disreputable and filthy soldier number 6A, and we had battle scenes, and we had all sorts of grit and grind, because we were doing the history plays at the time, this one being Henry VI.
Right.
So that was, and of course understudying like mad, understudying the lead in Henry VI, understudying the chorus that Bill Hutt played in Henry V,
Right.
and that was a wonderful experience.
Well, why I actually mentioned those two characters of Plummer and Plummer, William Shatner, was that they talked about working in Ottawa and Stratford in terms of just, it was the best repertoire they could work at,
Yeah.
because they weren't performing one play, they were practicing another play, and they would have to flip over really, really quickly. It was
Yes.
a great training ground.
It was great training. In fact, one of the early experiences for me before the theatre school was as apprentice at Wyndham's Garden Centre Theatre in Vineland, Ontario. Now, it's no longer in existence, but at the time, these were the days of summer stock, when you had TV stars who would take the summer off and appear as leads in shows that would be a very nice vehicle for them. They would come touring in, and we, as apprentices, would have small walk-on parts. You never got the script. What you got was what they call sides.
Right.
Sides, in this case, were made of something akin to onion paper, I guess Stettner print, which is blurred, with only your line preceded by the line before and the line after. You had no idea what the play was about.
And you just had your cues.
And you just went by cues and hoped you have one rehearsal after building sets and painting them to run upstairs to the company manager who comes first, and he takes you through it.
Now, I'd like to move on to a very early series that you did. You sort of spent a lot of time in theater, but then you moved into TV with a rather odd thing called Strange Paradise. And
Yes.
you've probably been asked about this before because it is such an odd one.
It's
You want to
odd.
tell me a bit about this? This was actually a CBC production or co-production.
It was, I think, since
69.
In 1969 it came out, that's right. And 1970, it ran for, I think we did about 132 episodes. Although that means doing one episode a day in the schedule. Now what happened with that was, the thing that inspired it was an already existing kind of Gothic soap opera. And this was, in a sense, a spin from that with a competing network, which was franchised throughout the United States and a lot of smaller stations,
Right.
and CBC, who were brilliant in picking it up because it went on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Kids would get home and be glued to the set for half an hour, having their Gothic soap thriller going on. The reason that this came about at all was through an accident. I was in The Three Musketeers, and this is now after the theatre school, as you say, 1969, and I had an accident on the set, which caused me to be in hospital for about 6 weeks and then about 3 months recovery. It was where I had a fall and I broke my neck and back.
Ooh.
So then I was in neck collars and everything, and thank God I never had any paralysis, but I came very close.
You got lucky.
I'm very lucky. So while I was recuperating, I made a phone call to a casting agent and said, I might be able to work without these collars. She said, you're kidding, because there's a person that has to be replaced and he's the lead in this soap opera. I said, what is it? And she explained, Strange Paradise. So from that point, after getting out of the neck collars, I went to Ottawa, and that's where they shot it, at Budge Crawley's studio in just over the over the river on the Quebec side.
Yeah, Crawley Films.
Yeah, Crawley Films. And he rented out this studio, which was all cement block and very hot because it was August when we started and no air conditioning. Plus the fact that it hadn't been open for quite some time, which unleashed a plague of flies. It looked like video breakup because you'd have them going zap right across the screen as you're doing a scene. And I remember I was having a cup of tea in this little cafe, and one of them kamikazed into the tea, made quite a noise. But we were shooting live to tape in those days.
Right, of course
we
it
just
would be,
went
yeah,
through it,
yeah.
you know, because editing was so expensive.
Your first award, at least a Gemini Award, I believe it was.
It was actually a genie.
For Witness to Yesterday? I'm talking about Witness to Yesterday.
No, actually it wasn't. It was another Lord Durham character
Oh,
that I
okay.
played. The Lord Durham character I played that won the award was actually for TVO.
Oh, I see.
And
So you played him twice.
I played him twice, yeah. I was sort of on a run of Lord Durham in 1970, I think it was. And then I got a nomination for the Genie Award for 71, and to my surprise, and I had absolutely nothing prepared, I won. In those days, it wasn't a televised situation. It was
Right, of course.
very, quiet, low-key, a little column in the Globe and Mail. But it was nice to have the award.
Did you think that your theatrical training, because there wasn't much of a film business, as you well know, back in the certainly early to mid-70s, but you seem to be working fairly steady. So was it theatrical training? Was it the voice? What did you think that...
Yeah, I think so, largely. I've talked with other actors who've made a career of voiceovers and doing narration.
Right.
And I think that was the saving grace, because whenever there wasn't a great deal of work for on camera or particularly stage, I would be able to do voiceovers.
Right.
And that I again attribute to Eleanor Stewart, whose training was superb for giving you the tools you need to make narration very interesting.
How did you feel during the sort of mid to late 70s when a lot of schlock was being made and a lot of American actors were coming up and taking secondary or even lead roles? How did that sort of sit with you?
I fortunately at the time, we were immune to the extent that CBC was doing a great deal of production itself.
Okay.
CTV was just getting into it. Global hadn't even started. But eventually, that began to overwhelm us with the realization that a lot of American actors were coming up. And so I thought, that's interesting. I wonder what happens if I go down to the States then.
Right.
Which eventually was a plan hatched in 1982.
Because you ended up in New York.
In New York.
But before you go to New York, I do want to bring up one film because it's a very favorite, and you got cut out of it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you must. It's like losing the position of the Beatles.
Yes.
You got cut out of A Christmas Story.
I know.
Ming the Merciless.
Ming the Merciless.
Let's just tell your fans of A Christmas Story what happened to Ming the Merciless.
Okay. The whole thing is about this young boy wanting to have for a Red Ryder BB gun.
Right.
And his father said, "You shoot your eye out. Forget about it." And he's kept hoping and hoping. He comes up to Santa and sits on his knee. The Santa's horrible man who just sends him down a slide and ignores him at this department store. The whole thing is set in the 1940s.
Right.
One of the fantasies he has is shooting these bad guys who are all coming over in big prison stripes over the fence of his backyard. Has this fantasy of plugging each one of them. And the other fantasy is rescuing Flash Gordon from the evil grip of Ming the Merciless. Now, Ming the Merciless arrives on the scene in a space balloon. So what happens, they got me all made up in this Fu Manchu kind of makeup, and I'm coming out of the ceiling of the set on this huge space balloon. The very good-looking guy, whose name I can't remember at the moment, played Flash Gordon, and there's little Peter Billingsley playing the boy with his BB gun shooting down the balloon of Ming the Merciless, and there's an effect where he goes flying away, and it's cut. I was in New York by the time it came out in 1983, and I took my stepdaughter, Sarah, who was about, I don't know, I guess about 3 or 4 years old. I said, "Now, this is where it's coming up."
No.
So we're waiting for it to come up. I said, "That's funny. Well, it may be a little later, Sarah, don't worry about it." And I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh no, they've cut it. But you know what? One of the saving graces is the fact that since my name is in the credits,
That's what it sort of struck me as odd. Yeah.
I get the residuals.
Oh, you don't?
I get the residuals.
You disappoint your granddaughter, but you know.
I made up for it because I finally got her the video when she watched it.
There's also another very good one here I noticed on your resume. Donald Britton's Canada's Sweetheart.
Yes.
A very controversial
It
cinema
was.
based about the U.S. labor leader, Hal Banks.
Hal Banks.
And
Right.
the Seafarers Union.
Yes, that's right.
And getting rid of that guy.
Yeah, that
Who was backed by backed by government.
Oh yes, I mean he was the hardest person to dislodge.
Yeah.
And Maureen Chaikin played him brilliantly.
Yeah, brilliantly,
It was a
yeah.
great role. And I was his Crown prosecutor and giving him a hard time, but he just, yeah, it was fine. In fact, I think he came through most of it unscathed. He just flew over the border and
Right.
said, "I'm back in the States."
Yeah, he just packed his bags and said, "I'm gone."
Packed his bag and gone.
Yeah, you're not gonna persecute him.
No, no, he was a tough guy.
But you said you played the Crown Prosecutor, which is interesting because do you feel that you've been set to these sort of distinguished roles of... Lord Durham and Crown Prosecutors,
Yeah.
and I mean, versus seems like something that would be a bit more fun.
It's actually, my wife Carol teased me about that because she said, you know, it's either Crown Prosecutors or priests. I went through a priest phase in New York. I was in The Equalizer, Law and Order, Get Spencer, one of those. I'm always playing a priest. That happened to be my New York thing for a while until I could finally break out of it to get into something else. But it's funny how it goes. You do get typecast.
Right, but you did end up in New York. So what was that decision? Was it to look for further greener pastures? Or
Yes.
You've been working for quite a while in Canada.
I had been a while, and working fairly well. One of the reasons I really wanted to get into it is that a friend of mine, also from the theatre school, Al Blevis, made a fantastic career for himself doing voiceovers. Now, if I could do voiceovers, and that would supplement my love of the theatre, because the theatre, even in New York, doesn't pay that much, unless you're on Broadway.
Right.
So I thought, that's a plan, I'll go down. And I spoke with Don Buchwald, who heads his own agency. He was one of the most influential agents, and thanks to Al, I had an intro to him. And he said, how much money have you got? Well, I said, I brought down, you know, some money. He said, you'll need it, because I'm going to send you around, but nobody's going to hire you for about 6 months.
Right.
Because it's just, they get used to you, you've got to get to know people. It's the same in any business, really. It's not just, you know, what you can do, it's who you know.
Right.
And they get to know you, and then they get to trust you, and then they say, okay, we'll book him for a session. But that took a long time.
It seems like a well-trodden path, though, for a lot of Canadians. It's either the long flight to LA or the short flight to New York.
Yes, it is.
And you did end up on Broadway.
I did, actually, in 1985.
So tell me about that.
Well, Clifford Williams, the director, actually knew me from Theatre Toronto when we had that short season at the Royal Alex. And that season was from 1968 to 69, I think it was. And in that I had some nice roles, one of which was Soldiers. Now Soldiers, the Rolf Hochhuth play, is a very controversial play about the firebombing of Dresden, the actions of Churchill during the war, as opposed to the actions of the Nazis. It was written by a Swiss German, and so people were a little bit resistant to it, but it packed them in.
I do remember that. I do remember Soldiers, yeah, Winston Churchill.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
John Colicos played Winston
Right,
Churchill.
yes, that's yeah.
He was uncanny. He was really good. So we took it to Broadway. That was the first Broadway thing. And it bombed there. We ran for 19 days because it's right in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Right, and no one wanted to know.
No one wanted to bother with watching a war play.
Right.
That was it. So I did a couple of other plays while I was there, and then came back to Canada. But the sort of itch to get back to New York stayed.
Right.
And so I finally went down, and it was Clifford Williams who directed Soldiers, who directed a thing called Pack of Lies, with Rosemary Harris, and Patrick McGowan. And working with these wonderful actors was a great thrill, and we had a fairly good run there. It was good.
You did, getting back to Canada, again, a lot of different movies, but started to work a lot of voice.
Yes, it did.
I noticed here Friday the 13th, oh, actually no, it's not a voice, but there's The Legend of Zelda, Beetlejuice, what else, Rupert
the Bear, yes.
How did that, is that your bread and butter?
Oh, not necessarily, but it was certainly the jam, I would say, because it was great having a series where you could come back and do it. Doing animation is so different from working in theater or, let's say, on CBC radio drama, because you usually work in a group. But once you do a table read of a particular character and you've got that going, you just come in yourself and do all the lines, and then you leave, and then they put it all together.
Yeah.
Which is very odd. But I enjoyed doing it because I had also adapted to doing different characters with my voice. So I didn't just do what I sound like, I did all sorts of different crazy characters, like the the one in Rupert the Bear and so on.
Well, I just happened to, Rupert's a favorite of mine. I was born
Yeah.
British, and Rupert was part of my
Oh,
upbringing.
yes,
I love
it's a
Rupert the
great
Bear.
series.
Nice animation with Rupert the Bear.
It was very nice.
In 1990, you did a film called Beautiful Dreamers. Another reverend.
Yes, another reverend.
Why would I mention that? It was just because John Kent Harrison was just interviewed on CBC because he's still working as a director.
I would imagine so. He's been down in LA for a long time.
Yeah.
And he may be coming up here.
Well, just to explain to the viewers that Beautiful Dreamers is about a doctor in London, Ontario, who has radical methods of treating insane people.
That's right.
Humanely, not strapping them down, and a chance encounter with Walt Whitman.
That's right.
And Colin was in it.
Colin was in it as the young doctor.
Right.
Dr. Buck, his
Rip
name was.
Torn was Walt Whitman.
Rip Torn was Walt Whitman.
A nice film, really not known much at all, but just seeing John Kent Harrison and thinking this is actually, he's done okay.
He's done wonders with some scripts, and this one particularly was a good script. It certainly attracted Rip Torn, who was marvelous as Walt Whitman.
Yeah.
One thing he did, I'm really thankful for. Often when you're doing a crowd that's addressing a crowd, so I'm on the pulpit, let's say, doing this speech to the congregation, being very critical of the free thinkers like Walt Whitman.
Right.
Because Reverend Haynes was a bit of a stick. So anyway.
London, Ontario.
Yes, London, Ontario, very conservative. So anyway, what I did was provide eyeline for all the characters who were doing the scenes with all the extras there.
Right.
Then, when they turn the cameras around, they dismiss everybody. So I don't have the actors. And Rip Torn said, hold it, just a second here. I'm not wrapped. As long as he's up there and he wants eyeline, I'm coming back and sitting down here. So when you set up, call me in my dressing room and I'll come. Well, the other actors came as well.
Oh, that's very
among them.
generous.
And
Yeah.
that's a real actor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's, he understands, he's done a lot of stage, he understands the importance of relating to somebody. While you're giving a speech that's quite critical of them.
It's funny, I just saw an interview with Kevin Spacey who said the same thing when he did Glengarry Glen Ross. And he had to do a reaction scene to Al Pacino chewing him out, And so the camera was on him and he had to react, but Al stuck it out, and not only did he stick it out, he started insulting him in a personal way off the script.
Oh, great.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and then Kevin Spacey afterwards, he said, it was a bit shook up, he said it was very generous because he gave him something to work with instead of
Yeah.
just talking into the void.
Yeah. I mean, so I've often been on films where you're talking to a tennis ball that's sitting on top of a piece of pike,
Right.
and that's your eyeline.
Yeah.
That's not fun.
No.
So I much prefer what Rip Torn and Al Pacino did.
Yeah, and Kevin Spacey does a pretty good Al Pacino.
He's great. I saw that.
He's an impersonator.
Yeah, he's a very good impersonator. Dangerous.
You were in Conspiracy of Silence, which was a big miniseries.
Yes, it was.
And Maniac Mansion, which is
Oh, that was
a
fun.
Joe Flattery.
Yeah, with Joe Flattery. And it's very
Tell us
much.
a little about Maniac, because I've seen it a couple. I mean, I didn't see the whole thing. That was off the wall, crazy.
It's completely off the wall, and that's what I loved about it. It's really that sort of gang of Eugene Levy and
Joe Flattery.
Joe Flattery, and
Yeah.
all the people who are part of that crazy group.
Right.
And in this, of course, you had Joe as the lead, and I'm playing his dad, who's completely eccentric and off the wall. And it was such a
There was a
delight.
character that was a fly, wasn't there, or something?
Yeah, there's a character, a fly,
head or.
some fly head that talked to him, Just,
I love that. It was just totally off
just
the wall.
completely crazy.
And another crazy character, Chris Farley,
Yes,
in Tommy Boy,
Tommy Boy, Chris
which was
Farley.
shot in Toronto.
It was shot in Toronto, and I want to say right out that Chris Farley is, again, one of the most generous actors I've ever worked with.
Right.
He was charming, funny. The thing about Chris was that he was like hyper all the time. He could never quite turn it off. He just had this ebullient sense of fun and energy and things, and of course that eventually killed him because he just, I think, overindulged.
Yeah.
David Spade was marvelous also to work with. So when we first, we have a little table read, and we don't really get much of that, and then you get on the set, and you've only got that scene that day to try to do it, and they want to get it done before lunch. that kind of feel. And everybody stepped up to the plate. And he gave me actually the liberty to really do something a little bit crazy, which is exactly what they wanted.
Well, Farley and I guess John Candy, those guys have only got a limited span on them. I mean,
I know, it's sad because you wish them to go on forever.
because they have such talent.
Yes.
But Farley actually had a bit of a John Belushi thing going on.
Yeah,
He knew how John Belushi burnt out, and he was pretty much going the same route.
he was, and it's too bad because, I mean, the things that he did on screen were absolutely amazing. And it's one of those actors who really breaks the envelope. He dares to do things that other actors wouldn't touch, you know.
Another quirky one, which I'd like to talk about just briefly, because I don't know how much you read it, but Elvis meets Nixon,
Oh, yeah.
which was shot in Toronto.
Shot in Toronto at the airport.
And it's just a story of the one time that Elvis left Nashville, or wherever it was, to go to the White House, and he didn't have his retinue with him, and he just expected to walk into the White House and meet the president.
That's right.
And they told him, well, you can't do it without an appointment. So he comes back on Monday and meets the president. That's the famous picture of Nixon. With apparently the most famous picture, the most popular picture of Nixon is with Elvis Presley.
Oh yes, I can imagine. I would imagine too that at auction, those photographs would go for quite a lot of money.
So what was your involvement in that?
Well, I played actually a chauffeur. I was Elvis's chauffeur.
I remember that.
And he would have all these sort of wild things, and the chauffeur is very sang-froid. He's very conservative, quiet, and Elvis trusted him, and Elvis could talk to him. He would say things, Mr. Presley, I don't think it's a good idea to bring your gun to the White House. I think it would be a better idea if perhaps we leave it in the car, that kind of thing.
But he did walk into the White House.
He did walk in.
With a matching set.
Yeah, with matching set of pistols.
Yeah.
Security in those days was a different thing, I guess.
But the bizarre notion was that Elvis had no clue. He couldn't, he didn't know how to spend money, he didn't know how to use credit cards, without his retinue, he was, lost.
I'm afraid his retinue cost him too.
Yeah, I know.
That was the other problem.
All right, now, there's a series that became very popular, TBS, wasn't it? Nero Wolfe?
Nero Wolfe, yes, that was actually A&E.
A&E.
Yeah.
A&E. And you reconnect with Mort Chaikin.
Yes.
Because he's your boss. So Nero Wolfe is played by Chaikin, and you're the...
I'm Fritz.
Fritz
is his combination chef and butler, and gets in arguments quite often with Nero Wolfe because Wolfe is a gourmand and very fussy about how his dishes are done, and Fritz, being Swiss French, is also very fussy about being criticized. So they get into these arguments. And then, of course, you have Tim, who plays the character Archie in this.
Right, the gumshoe.
The gumshoe.
Right.
Archie the gumshoe, yeah. And so we had, those were very elaborately shot, beautifully photographed. I think it was one of the first series in those days done in HD.
Right.
And that's served it well, I think, now, because if it's ever repeated anywhere, the only problem is that in fact, the reason that the series was even cancelled at all was because A&E did a sudden 360 and wound up doing Swamp People and Pawn Stars.
Oh, in other words, cheaper reality shows.
Cheaper reality shows. They fired their creative staff, and they just went with this. So we're actually, what you're looking at when you looked at Nero Wolfe was the last of A&E, the art part of A&E in existence.
Which moved over basically to HBO and AMC.
Exactly.
Who do that sort of, like Walking Dead and The Sopranos and that sort of stuff.
And A&E just shovels in the money from reality shows.
Trashy reality shows.
And very trashy, I'm sorry.
But Nero Wolfe has got a big following.
Yes.
So you're talking, Sherlock Holmes territory.
Yes,
you
really
don't mess with it, right?
Yes.
So what was the reaction to your version?
I
thought Murray was very good as Wolfe.
Yeah, he was marvelous as Wolfe, and Tim Hutton was marvelous as Archie, his wisecracking gumshoe kind of guy. We had actually an interesting thing too, that Tim Hutton, being a co-executive producer, had developed, and that is a repertory company, where you had, like in the old films, let's say like a studio production, you have people coming into other episodes who played one thing in one episode and another in the new episode. They would change characters.
Right.
And that repertory thing was quite a breakthrough, even though it's very old-fashioned to do. But in terms of the quality, I think a lot of people really liked it because it really was faithful to the Nero Wolfe plan.
I'm a big fan of these sort of mystery things if they're done right.
If they're done right, yes.
If they take cheap shots with it or make it sort of gumshoe style, but if it's faithful to the original source, and I think that was.
Yeah.
Which comes to Dr. Anton Hendricks.
Oh, yes.
Now, you must still get people, because that was a really popular series.
Very
I'm
popular
talking about Sci Factor, Chronicles of the Paranormal.
Exactly.
Hosted by Dan Aykroyd, who is a true believer, I understand.
Yes, he is. Oh, he is. I mean, he and his brother, apparently in their house near Kingston, I guess were first introduced to it by the fact the house is haunted. And he was fascinated with the goings-on of this house, kind of poltergeist kind of hauntings, where things move, and your dog sees something, and there's nothing there, that kind of feeling. So I think that started him off on this, albeit fictional, outfit called the Investigation for Scientific and Paranormal Activity.
Oh, that's what it was.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that's what it was. I forgot the real name. But anyway, they were very careful in saying not based on, but inspired by.
Okay.
Because some of the stories are like, what? And others are fascinating. My job as the character is acting as a psychiatrist, working with people who have gone through the trauma of having had a paranormal experience or having seen one. And usually I'm winding up talking gently to them, hypnotizing them, etc., etc. It's a very interesting part. And yes, you're right, it's very popular still.
Right, and do you get recognized as?
Well, I'll tell you something, it's amazing. My wife and I were in Naples, Italy. And we, like most Canadians, we tended to eat a bit earlier than the Italians, who eat very late.
Right.
So we went into this pizza place because Neapolitan pizza is just magnificent. And the chefs were already having their meal because they have a late night ahead of them. So one of them wrote on a napkin, there's no English exchange because they didn't speak English, and we spoke a little Italian, held it up and said, Sci Factor, on the napkin. And that was so cute because I was, yes, so great. But the story goes, we managed to find out what the reason why is because they got off at about 2 or 2:30 in the morning. At 3 in the morning, in Neapolitan TV, on would come Sci Factor. And because of their shift, they're still awake, so they watch it.
Odd how these things work, right? You wouldn't have thought,
know.
At that point in your career, you'd end up,
Yeah, sitting in a pizzeria in Naples.
Right.
Yeah.
With Sci Factor. You have been sort of continuing to work since then. I mean, you're non-stop, but a bit of a workaholic, aren't you?
Well, I try, actually, it seems that way because I fill up the resume with a lot of things. But lately I've been kind of slowing down a bit because I've been doing something else. I've had another career, which has largely been working with musicians, which I love. That started back in 1974 when the director Leon Major recommended me to the Toronto Symphony and Seiji Ozawa. It's very rarely performed, but it's an adjunct really to Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, his big huge work. Following that, there's a sort of work called Lelio, and this is where, as in the end of Symphonie Fantastique, the character sleeps away thanks to opium, and in Lelio he wakens from an opium dream, and then has all these fantasies of what he wants to do. The whole thing basically was Berlioz's love letter to Harriet Smithson, who was an actress from England, he in France. And unfortunately the relationship never quite worked out, but he did leave us with Lelio.
Right.
So when Seiji moved to Boston, I did it there again with the Boston Symphony. And that's a whole other thing because I didn't read music, I didn't know what my cues were, and he was very marvelous. He'd give me these little elbow cues, a little thing with a baton I had to watch for in order to where to come
Right.
in. And I've learned since then that working with musicians is a joy. I love it.
You do. I'm glad you mentioned this because of a number of CDs.
Oh yes, that's right.
Tchaikovsky Discovers America. I know. I picked up one of my notes, which received a Juno Award.
Yes, that's right. It was for Best Children's Recording that year.
Right. So what was your?
And I played Tchaikovsky.
Oh, I see.
And Tchaikovsky actually did come to New York. And it was just at the time that Carnegie Hall was being built. And they said, well, we can't accommodate you now, so would you like to take some time off, maybe go up into the Adirondacks or wherever you want to go? And he said, yes. So then the fiction comes in where there's two children with him on the train.
No, I see.
And he's describing how some of his music was created, particularly from the Nutcracker. And you have this wonderful sound going on in the album where he describes what a cup of coffee sounds like when it's just being poured and when it's being tasted, and then there's music playing behind and that kind of thing. It's very charming. It's a very nice thing.
And you still do the CDs? Audio?
No, it's that's done.
That's done. That's just
a one-shot deal, and then many years later, Simon Weinberg, who is a well-known classical guitarist here in Toronto, Simon would go down every now and then to the U.S. Library of Congress. And that's where you can do a great deal of research into music. And so he was looking for something that would be a little off the wall, and he found this beautiful music by Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, an Italian, northern Italian composer, who had to leave Italy because he was a Jew in 1939 when Mussolini came into power, or was into power. And he found this classic piece by a Nobel laureate. His name is Juan Ramon Jimenez. And Jimenez wrote this thing about a donkey and its rider.
Yeah.
And it's a favorite of children all over Spain.
I know something about this. Is Disney going to be able to?
No, Disney hasn't got to it at all.
No, it's
Thank
a
goodness.
lonely bill. Well,
Yes.
you have been, I guess I don't want to keep on emphasizing, but sort of dating back well into the 50s and now into the new century. Comment on your changes in the business. How's it, I mean, apart from that it's obviously a lot bigger. Is it any better? Is it
Well, in
for
some
Canadian
ways-
actors?
In some ways it is, because certainly Canadian actors are being respected, much more so. There's, for instance, as we speak, there is a film called Room.
Right, which is Oscar nominated.
It's an Oscar-nominated actress who's Canadian, and I think largely a Canadian production.
Yeah.
Which is something to be very proud of because it's an excellent film, beautifully acted, and I think something that stands very proudly as a small independent film up there with the big guys,
Right.
and right in competition. So that is a huge growth. I think the thing that is somewhat missing, of course, are the more fun, intimate days of doing radio drama. Radio drama is pretty well gone now from CBC. But it was, I think, a wonderful experience to work on people's imagination. That's all they have is what they hear and what they imagine. And often I think radio provides such a great entertainment. I mean, the adjunct of that really is talking books.
Right.
People go for a long drive, they put on a CD and listen to a whole story, a novel, and it can be thoroughly absorbing when you're going along the long, dull passages of the 401.
Right.
And that was the service that radio provided as well, I think.
I think that certainly CBC radio, I go back to those dramas, and it's some of the best stuff, you know, a lot better than TV.
Yes, it
It's
is.
a lot more intelligent, a lot clever, and some really off-the-wall stuff that you wouldn't expect coming out of the CBC.
That's right.
Alan McPhee.
Alan
He
McPhee,
was one of the greats.
hilarious. Pleasure.
You've done the theater, you've done the radio, you've done TV, you've done film, and you did also Guthrie on Guthrie.
Yes, a
which
one-man
you took
show.
that back to Stratford, or the one-man show.
Yeah, that's
Can you
right.
talk a bit about that?
Well, actually, it was Douglas Campbell who called me up one day and said, "Dear boy, I think there's a script for you to do. I think you'd be marvelous at it." And so I went to Douglas and met him. He said, "Now, there's this woman who is a producer at BBC, and she's done it there, and she's coming over to Canada, and she'd like to do it here, particularly since he was here for Stratford and was the man who, with Tom Haverson, started it off. And so it's based on life in the theatre, his autobiography, and Margaret Dale, the producer, also had edited the piece, and so we got together, and Douglas said, now, she can be very determined and rather inclined to hang on like a limpet. But anyway, we got together, and I had a few arguments with her, and it was like pulling teeth, trying to have a slightly more theatrical end to the first act, and so on and so forth. But we got there, we did a few trial runs, and then finally it was accepted at Stratford at the Tom Pattison Theatre, ironically enough. And who should be there but Tanya Milzevich, the original designer of the Stratford stage.
Oh, really?
And one of the major designers through the early years with Guthrie and also with Michael Langham. And I thought, oh boy, because she was a very intimate friend of Tyrone Guthrie.
Right.
Here I am doing this, not imitation, but impression of this great man, and I thought, what is she going to think? And she didn't really want to come either, because she still had a soft spot for Guthrie, who died in 1981. And so I got a letter from her afterwards, and she said, I didn't really want to come, but you did something that brought it back.
Oh, good.
It was such, I've treasured that letter. That's better than any review.
Did you meet the man when you were Richard?
Yes, I did actually. He came to Stratford when I was just in my first year, 1966, and we all met in this rather crowded reception room, and Guthrie towered above everyone else. He was 6'6".
Oh, really?
Big man.
Big man.
And he was sort of looking around, slightly displeased, and I don't know why I said it, but I was tongue-tied. I didn't know. I adored the man, but I said, "You're very tall, aren't you?" And he looked down and he said, "Yes." So I think that was the extent. I think that was the extent of my talking with Guthrie. I would love to have been directed by him.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You still do theater, or?
Yes, actually the theater I'm doing, in a sense, is a combination of music and theater. It's actually called Music as Theater, which was a brainchild of Andrew Kwan, who was a music agent and manager, really, of artists throughout Canada. He and I had met a number of times socially, thanks to going to concerts and things. And he said, I've got an idea. It's 2010 coming up, and it was the 200th anniversary of the birth of the composer Robert Schumann.
Okay.
Now, Robert Schumann is a fascinating character because he went mad. And what happened to his relationship with Clara Schumann, who was a brilliant pianist, even more famous in those days than he was.
Right.
And we're talking about the mid-19th century. Their relationship went through a really difficult trial because her father was a martinet and loathed Robert Schumann and didn't want his daughter marrying her. And so they had to fight that, and then finally they get together, and finally his mind starts to disintegrate. So what we did, I wrote a piece called The Schumann Letters, and used real quotes from letters by Schumann and Clara, diary entries from the both, music throughout. So we had Michael Kim, who was Dean of Music at the time of Manitoba, Brandon University of Manitoba, and we had Susan Gilmore Bailey, who was a soprano, Canadian soprano, who was trained at the British Academy in London. And we got together, the three of us, and I narrated, he played, she sang, and we toured about 50 venues across Canada.
When was this?
This is between roughly 2010 and 2013.
So really true, old actors don't fade away.
They don't fade away, no. Retirement is a word that's virtually unknown.
Because Christopher Plummer, who just got yet another award for Remembrance, the Edward Norton film, I've just been impressed with these guys. They just don't stop.
No.
And I take it sort of this, Clint Eastwood, Woody Allen, they just don't stop.
No.
You're like that, aren't you?
I feel like that. I don't feel my
You want to die on stage? Is that right? Is that it?
Yeah.
I think that's what it is, you know?
I think it is. I think it's just a love, and you do what you love. As Joseph Campbell, the philosopher, said, follow your bliss.
Yeah, I remember images of John Huston in a wheelchair, you know, strapped up to a,
Yes.
intravenous, but he was still going to direct.
Still going to direct.
And he directed The Dead, which is actually
Remarkable.
a remarkable film
Remarkable
from an old man. You know?
Yeah.
So what's next for Colin Fox? What are you up to?
Well,
You've just moved out of town.
I've just moved recently to Elora, yeah. And it's a very lovely community. I think what attracted us, my wife Carol and I, was the fact that we were crazy about music, mainly choral music, mainly classical music, but they did everything at the Elora Festival, which takes place every year from July through the month of July. And there's a lot of festivals going on at that time anyway, it's great. And I started working with them. I went into collaboration with the Penderecki Quartet, with the Griffin Trio, who are a wonderful trio, and with Anton Querty, the concert pianist. I've done some pieces. And it's been just a delight working with fantastic musicians, because I think one of the three, to tell the truth, they kind of are amazed at what I do, and I'm amazed at what they do. And there's sort of a mutual admiration society, where if it's fellow actors, oh yeah, it's him. But when it's with musicians, they say, how do you do that? I say, how do you do that? You're so perfect, how can you do that, you know? So we get along very well, and I like working with them.
If you weren't an actor, what would you be?
If I wasn't an actor, I think I would be a writer, for one thing. I think also I would be a teacher. I think teaching is a marvelous thing to do. I never did that, but I have a feeling I would like to do that. Or a director.
It's been a great pleasure, Mr. Fox. Thank you very much for coming back to Commffest TV.
Well, thanks very much. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure.